and I will talk about the interpretation of Hungarian Holocaust survivors' restitution letters, which was actually part of my doctoral research. And I will just briefly introduce a historical background, because I'm pretty sure that not everyone is, well, basically, I guess no one is familiar with the history of the Hungarian Holocaust and restitution afterwards, which was basically non-existent. So in Hungary, there was a big Jewish population in 1944, which meant approximately 800,000 people. And there were major anti-Jewish laws introduced from 1938, which restricted the presence of Jews in the liberal professions and the economic fields, and confiscated Jewish land property, and marriage between Jews and non-Jews was forbidden. Able-bodied Jewish men were drafted into unarmed military labor service, which was a means of humiliation, of course, because they couldn't serve in the regular army. And all this happened before the German occupation on the 19th of March in 1944. When it came to the German occupation, the leader of the country, who was Regent Miklós Horthy, stayed in office, and he appointed a new German-friendly government. And afterwards, the ghettoization and the deportations were implemented very, very quickly, which was done by 200,000 Hungarian civil servants, gendarmes, policemen, etc. Basically, from mid-April, the ghettoization started, and from mid-May, the deportations, chiefly to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and until the 8th of July, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported. Basically, the entire rural Hungary was emptied. Only the Jews of Budapest remained in Hungary. And in this whole process, there were many non-Jews involved, as I have already mentioned, but the general population was mainly involved in the confiscation and the redistribution of Jewish businesses and real estates, and shops and Jewish homes and movables. Many people were looting Jewish houses or the ghettos after the deportation, and in many cases there were auctions held locally where the local non-Jews could buy Jewish property underpriced. And after the war, there were approximately 200,000 pauperized and traumatized Holocaust survivors living in Hungary, which was much smaller than this territory you can see here. This is the 1944 territory of Hungary. But after the war, again, these territories were taken away, and we had what is today basically the borders of Hungary. And I will come to the restitution. So Hungary made an armistice with the Soviet Union on the 20th of January 1945, and this contained that all former restrictive laws must be annulled or withdrawn. The government implemented several decrees concerning restitution. However, they did not take into consideration the special situation of the survivors. For instance, Decree 300 of 1946 stated that survivors have the right to claim their Aryanized property. However, only those goods which were lost after the 19th of March 1944, or properties whose new owner knew about its origin, and goods necessary for living, which is in quotation marks, such as furniture or clothes, could not be reclaimed. This means that this decree basically served the interest of the non-Jews. And then Act 25 of 1946, which was called Condemning the Persecution of the Hungarian Jews and Easing its Consequences, this act proposed a fund which would have inherited heirless property and aid poor survivors. However, this law also stated that the responsibility was entirely the Germans and the Arrow Cross, which was the Hungarian anti-Semitic party, and it came to power only in October 1944. And it labeled anti-Jewish measures as, and I quote, the alien influence of fallen regimes, and therefore denied Hungarian complicity. And this, of course, raised the question whether the state was obliged to provide restitution if it is not responsible for the suffering of the Hungarian Jews. And the lack of restitution can be traced back to a multitude of reasons. First of all, very important is that the Soviet authorities and radical leftist political forces in Hungary were more interested in stabilizing the economy of the country. And many workers and members of the so-called proletariat received Jewish property. And of course, these political forces didn't want to lose their support, their political support, and therefore they did not also support restitution. The new proprietors many times renovated or repaired Jewish goods or even sold them later on, and therefore the value or the owner of these properties changed, and such valuables were much harder to recover, or of course they were often simply not willing to give them back. I have to also mention that the political parties obtained Jewish properties, and since they were complicit in the whole process, obviously they didn't support the restitution. And of course, after the war, there was a catastrophic economic situation and a very strong anti-Semitism in Hungary, and therefore there was no real political will to give back everything to the survivors. And as a consequence, the survivors themselves had to retrieve their properties. And now I come to the restitution letters, which are going to be the main topic of my presentation. So these letters basically contain a mixture of personal and official sentences or topics, and the survivors often felt the need to justify why they have to get back their property, which sounds ridiculous because why wouldn't they get it back? But in the letters they refer to a number of these justifications, such as the new democratic laws, the experience of persecution, or being an integral member of the new democratic system, their expectations from this democratic system and offering skills to it. And sometimes they also mention that their family members are returning from the deportation and they want to create a new home for them, or that they were supporting the Russians and the Red Army. So they kind of demonstrate, these letters demonstrate a mindset and an emotional situation, and of course the current social situation of the survivors. And there are various layers which we can talk about when it comes to these letters. For instance, many of the survivors mentioned the events of the persecution, and therefore this generates knowledge about the microhistorical events of the Holocaust. They were very conscious about their own situation and the context of their situation, which we would call today historical knowledge. And of course, they wrote a lot about their contemporary situation, how they returned, what kind of trauma they had, how they lost their family members, and their previous life was ruined, etc. And of course, there are many emotions shown in these letters, such as grief for the lost family members and the hope for recovery. And some of them try to be objective, but still we can see the emotions through the lines. They also testify about Jewish and non-Jewish relations during and after the Holocaust, and there are insights into the author's feelings and mindset, and we can also see here strategies for coping with the trauma of the Holocaust. And now I come to my examples. The first letter was written by Mrs. Árpád Seres. She was born as Margit Schlesinger in 1899 in Monor, and she married a lawyer called Árpád Seres in 1926. Her 4 siblings and elderly mother were all killed during the Holocaust. She was the only survivor from her family. And her mother's home was given to Mrs. János Szűcs during the redistribution of Jewish goods, which led to a conflict because, according to the authorities, Mrs. Seres's mother had officially rented out the house and signed the contract, while Mrs. Sheresh, of course, denied this. And she wrote an appeal to the Ministry of Social Welfare in April 1945, in which she debated the local housing office's decision. Here you can see a page from her letter, so you can see that already here what kind of emotions she had because of this writing style, underlining the words and sentences. So it was in a very outraged and angered and disappointed state of mind. She had three main arguments in this letter why she should get back her own house. Before the decision, the housing office did not even interrogate me, but ascertained that my mother had signed the rental contract based on the statement of the current inhabitant. So basically, she questions the authenticity of the document, and there is an emotional layer that she was not taken seriously during this whole process. And the second argument, this does not mean that my mother had rented her house to Mrs. János Szűcs. She must have been forced to sign it. My mother was forced to go to the ghetto at that time, therefore she did not leave her home voluntarily. Mrs. Szűcs did not even wait until my mother's things were taken to the ghetto, but appeared at my mother's house, and referring to the municipality's appropriation order, she threw my mother's things out in the courtyard. It is unlikely that my mother would have rented her house to a woman who had demonstrated such behavior. So here we see this microhistorical event. There is an entire description of the ghettoization, and since she even mentions later on three witnesses of this scandalous behavior, this means that this whole thing happened in broad daylight. There is also, as I said, a knowledge of the past, and her own description of what we call today choiceless choices, like her mother was basically forced to give out her house. And of course there's an emotional layer because she feels contempt and antipathy towards Mrs. Szűcs, who moved into their house. And the third justification, Mrs. Szűcs doesn't even live in the house anymore, but smuggled her son-in-law in there, and she herself moved away. Therefore the house should have been allocated to me for this reason too. Moreover, because I'm bombed out and one-third owner of the house. So this refers to the laws and very logical arguments that she is also the owner of the house, and she's bombed out, which was also it meant that she should get some lodging. But from this letter we can see that this whole legal procedure was an emotional struggle for the survivors, because for many of them the lost possessions represented the pre-war life and the lost relatives, and of course this whole process put a burden on the Jewish and non-Jewish relations too. The next letter is that of Hermann Fischer. He wrote to the land claiming committee of BIA. These committees were responsible for implementing the land reform in Hungary and distribute land plots. The letter was dated on February 1946, and he claimed a house. And I quote his letter: "I have lived in Bia since 1931. My current home is bombed down and in an uninhabitable state. I was employed by the Bia Israelite community, but since it was annihilated, I lost my job, and now that I returned from deportation, I found a robbed home and nothing else. My faithful wife and 2 children were deported. According to witnesses, they were murdered. After all this suffering, I must make a new home." So actually there were 39 Jews living in Bia before the war, and the destruction of this community is depicted in this letter. Fischer's wife was 38 years old. They had 2 children, 39 and a 9-year-old. And as he writes, they were all killed during the Holocaust. So his situation is actually very typical to those who returned to a rural home in Hungary. Basically, they had nothing because their houses were looted and their relatives were killed. And as we can see, this letter is trying to be very objective, but still there are phrases which refer to his emotional state, such as, for instance, suffering. And here, this is very interesting that he is trying to overcome the trauma by building a new home, so he doesn't want the old house back, obviously, also because it was destroyed. The next letter is that of Sándor Placsek. It was dated in July 1945, and this was a letter written to the Pilis Csaba municipal leadership, and he requested to be allocated a horse to work his land. And he said that as soon as he could afford to buy a new horse, he would give this horse back. However, this claim was rejected, and here I am going to quote from Placsek's answer. I received the National Committee's resolution with the utmost shock, as if I had read the decree of a reactionary committee. According to a government decree, deportees must be supported. I do not want to use the horse for profiteering, but working my land. I was a farmer until my deportation. If you gave me all the horses of the town, even then you could not compensate for the damage caused by the fascist thugs. I lost all my family. There are plenty of horses owned by individuals who do not deserve them, only internment camp. I was a military laborer for 28 months. I don't have money to buy a horse, and while I was away from home, others who wished for Hitler's victory owned even 2 horses. I could cry with anger that a person who is not an enemy of this system is treated this way. So this is a much more heated letter than the previous one. Placsek actually lost 15 of his family members during the Holocaust, and he emphasizes that asking for a horse in exchange doesn't seem to be such a big deal. He mentions also the events of the persecution, such as his serving as a military laborer, and he is very aware of the legal circumstances and the regime change in Hungary after the war, and he knows that he deserves this kind of compensation. So here we can also see the expectation from the new democratic regime, and he also writes about practicalities, such as after the war, due to the economic situation, the government stressed the need to work the lands, and this also meets Placsek's own goal that he wants to work his own land. Of course, there are a lot of emotions here. He is outraged by the National Committee's decisions, and he shows very strong feelings in his letter. And also I have to call attention to this symbolic nature of compensation. He mentions that all the horses wouldn't be enough as a compensation, and this also refers to the trauma that he suffered and the potential solution, a feeling of revenge on the former perpetrators. In this letter also the Jewish-non-Jewish relations are mirrored, so individuals who sympathize with the Germans were still present in the town even after the war, and he felt contempt for these people. And my last letter is that of Tibor Frank. He wrote this letter to the municipality of Nógrád Velőce in the spring of 1947, and he asked back his father's Aladár Frank's land. My father, Aladár Frank, was deported in 1944, as a result of which he lost his life in Auschwitz. My father's property was a 1-acre land estate, which was confiscated in 1943 in accordance with the fascist laws due to my father's Jewish origins. It was given to the Social Welfare Cooperative of Nógrád County. This cooperative sold a part of the estates, as a result of which I, Tibor Frank, who had also returned from deportation, worked it even in the summer of 1946 in the absence of the owner. Due to the fascist laws, I not only lost my father, but his and my properties were ruined entirely, the equipment of the estate was destroyed, and the fruit trees were stolen. Therefore, I would get only a small compensation if, in line with the decree, I got back at least the estate. So he also enumerates a lot of different types of damages caused during the Holocaust. He lost his father, and they were expropriated and looted by the local non-Jews. Even the fruit trees were dug out from the land. And we can see here an emotional adherence to the land, because even though officially it wasn't his property, he still went back and worked on it. He was aware of the relevant laws and decrees, and he knew that there is a legal background which supports his claim. And similarly to Placzek, he also emphasized the need to work the land for the sake of rebuilding the country. In this letter we can see one of the difficulties which I mentioned in the beginning, the difficulty of restitution, because this land changed owners twice. And of course there is again the symbolic nature of the compensation, because he mentions that this land would be only a small compensation if he got it back in exchange for the death of his father. So this is not only in a material sense, but also due to the emotional attachment. And now I will come to my conclusions. So we can see that restitution letters provide a lot of information, not only about the individual's or family's fate, but also the microhistorical aspects of the Holocaust in smaller towns or villages. And they contribute to a deeper understanding of the Holocaust in Hungary, and therefore it is, I think, a shame that they weren't used as sources before. There is also, they are also important sources for the history of emotions and psychology and coping with the trauma. As we could see, there were different strategies for this. They could also be used for the history of mentality, how much the survivors knew about their historical context, what kind of narrative spread as good practice to get back one's property, and how much they shared with the authorities about their current situation. And through these letters we can understand much better the survivors and empathize with their situation. Thank you for your attention.
On a practical one, how long do these laws last? As in, what's the latest that these restitution laws continue to be enacted, or are they still being enacted? Are there different laws that you can still use now? And then, on more of a kind of theoretical point, I wanted to ask you how you believe these emotions are utilised. What strategies are they employing through these emotional outpourings to get their intended aim, right? So they talk about kind of almost like hyperbole, right? That I would take all the horses in Hungary, right? So what type of strategies like those are they using to achieve their aims? And on the thing. Regarding the materiality of the letters, you put a thing up on the first letter that you showed. I think it's on the slide number 7. This, yeah, down.
Oh, sorry, this one, right?
Yeah. The red underlining, I presume that's done by people that are receiving letters, right? Yeah. Which would suggest that at least if the letter's being passed on, they're not reading all of it anyway. Mm-hmm. They're only reading the bits that are red underlined, right? Yeah. So what parts are they underlining?
Okay, I should have to make it bigger to see. Oh yeah, it's about actually the legal background. It's not about the emotional things, but the legal background. Yeah.
So I suppose that would suggest, are the emotions actually being read, or are they just an outpouring by the people that are writing it?
Yeah. So about the laws, actually they were in effect during socialism. So Hungary became a socialist country in 1948-49. They remained in effect, but even after even during the pre-war years, nothing happened about restitution. So as I mentioned in the beginning, the governments didn't really reinforce these laws. So that's why people had to to struggle and write so many letters, because nothing happened. And if they themselves didn't do something and refer to the laws, then there was no support at all from the authorities. So, I mentioned one of these laws, which was, I'm sorry, This one, no? Yeah, this one, the Act 25, which proposed this fund. This was actually established, but they started to investigate inheritance cases, and they actually collected quite a few houses and apartments which used to belong to Jews, but there were no heirs to these real estates. And by the time they gathered enough money and fund for supporting the pauperized survivors, by the time Hungary became a socialist country, and they couldn't do anything. And in the end, basically they gathered 2 million forints, which was a huge sum at that time. And I found a source which was written in, I believe, 1974 or something, and it mentioned that these 2 million forints are still there on an account. So basically nothing happened about helping poor survivors or giving them any kind of restitution. So everything was done by joint and self-aid organizations in Hungary. You asked something, the emotions, yeah. I think many of these letters showed sincere emotions, at least what you could see in this letter. This one for sure was written like she was outraged and she just sat down and wrote the letter. But I'm quite sure that some of them did actually use this kind of emotional justifications. I mean, I can't blame them, of course, because obviously you want to get back your family's house, so you use whatever means you can. So it's interesting to think about that. I haven't thought about this before, but I will actually add this to as an analyzing point to these
There's
letters.
some work on First World War correspondence that talked about like emotional strategies that the people were using. I think. So I guess maybe to think of that.
Yeah. And the third question? Oh, yeah, it was about the underlining. Yeah. Okay.
And you described, obviously you understand the victims more, as opposed to the collaborators and their errors, or whatever we want to call them. But two questions. In the positive sense, until call it the socialist regime in the gap, what positive moves were there in restitution? And although we know these things in hindsight, did the victims, the survivors, have any notion that the way they're going to sort these problems out is through international pressure? Historically, that's the only way it happened.
Yeah.
That they couldn't depend on a regime, either regime in Hungary.
Yeah.
But so I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you have to say about that?
So I think that on a legal level, the Hungarian restitution laws were very progressive, let's say compared to Czechoslovakia or Poland, because there I don't think anything happened like these laws. They had their restitution laws, but they, for instance, didn't have this kind of fund that I was talking about. And this fund was already about compensation and not that much about restitution. So it was not only the material assets, but providing money and care and hospitalization to the survivors. So this was a more progressive line, I believe. And in this respect, I think these were very positive. But what was realized from this is basically nothing. So as far as I could see in my research, and as you mentioned, it all depended on these international organizations. So Joint was very strong in Hungary. I know that they gave like millions of dollars to Hungary because there was a big Jewish community and they needed all the aid they could get. And I also went through some of their documents. So they did everything. They opened kitchens for the poor. They were financing the hospitals. They were training the people. You know, they gave them agricultural training so that they could emigrate to Palestine, for instance, or they could train themselves to some different kind of position like before the war. So it was joint really helped on many levels, and they also had their Hungarian branch, which was called the National Jewish Aiding Committee. So they were very aware of the situation of the Hungarian survivors, and they really tried to help. So basically, these were the only organizations where Jews could turn to. And actually there were, I read a Zionist pamphlet from 1947 or 48 where they were writing with a very malicious voice that people are so dependent on the joint aid, and they don't even look for work because they get this fund from joint, and I mean, like, okay, but you lost your family, you are totally helpless, you don't have your social network at all. Of course you have to depend on that kind of aid for even for years. I mean, it's understandable. So
but all right, in terms of not just immediate philanthropy, but were there successes in this interim period of people getting any restitution, or probably not indemnity, but on the positive side, the florins just didn't stay in the bank. Who did succeed?
yeah, actually there were a couple. Like I mainly dealt with microhistory, so I know about people who lived in these small towns around Budapest, and I found sources about people who managed to agree with the non-Jew who moved into their house, for instance, or the non-Jew wrote to the municipality that the Jewish survivor came back home, so I want another house because I want to move out. So actually this happened, but it was much smaller proportionately than those who did not get back their property and had to fight for it. So actually I think that, like, I couldn't say percentages, but I know that like 80 or 90% didn't get back their properties.